So after adopting this as the first step in our emergent plan, we then spent some time unpacking what assessment for learning actually means and looking at what it means for us at Birdwood High School. So we focused a lot on the work of Professor Dylan William, who's done a lot of work on formative assessment, and used some of his work to guide what we were doing.
To me, formative assessment describes all those processes by which teachers and learners use information about student achievement to make adjustments to the students' learning that improve their achievement. So it's about using the information to adapt your teaching and adapt the work of the students to put the learning back on track, if you like, to make sure that the learning is proceeding in the right direction and to support that learning. So it's what happens when you don't just lecture students and rattle through the material until you get to the end and ask them if they've understood it okay. It's constantly making those adjustments. One of the ways I like to talk about it is just imagine what would happen if a pilot flew like many teachers assess. So I flew back from Seattle a few weeks ago. Just imagine what the pilot would have done. He would have flown east for 9 hours, and then after 9 hours he'd say it's time to land. So he'll put the plane down and he'll ask, is this London? And of course, even if it's not London, he says, well, everybody's got to get off because I've got to get onto the next journey. And that's exactly the way that we've assessed in the past. We teach students material, and at the end of that teaching, we find out if they've learned it or not. And if they haven't, we say, too bad, because we're on to the next unit. So what formative assessment does is encourages teachers to take constant readings about where students are, just in the same way that a pilot takes constant readings about their position. And if the learning isn't proceeding as you'd planned, then you make adjustments. That's the essence, to me, of formative assessment. So the reason I think that formative assessment is the right focus is because assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. It's only through assessment of some kind that you know whether what has been taught has been learned. And that's why I think this focus on this assessment process, minute by minute and day by day, not at the end of a sequence of learning, minute and day by day, allows teachers to reflect on their practice and make small steps in improving that practice in a more powerful way than anything we've seen before. When we started working on formative assessment, or assessment for learning as it's sometimes called, we were focusing very much on feedback. So we started with feedback because that's where the research was most clearly organized. We then realized that unless you'd asked the right question, then feedback wasn't very useful. So questioning and feedback came into the equation together. As we worked with teachers to implement this in classrooms, we discovered you couldn't change what the teacher was doing without changing what the students were doing. And in particular, the importance of student self-assessment, what we sometimes call activating students as owners of their own learning, and peer assessment, or what we sometimes call activating students as teaching resources for one another, assumed much greater salience. Now, when we talk about peer assessment, a lot of people immediately assume we're just talking about having kids marking each other's work so that the teacher doesn't have to do it. And people always get the wrong idea because that's summative peer assessment. What we have discovered is that formative peer assessment, where students are helping each other improve their work, has benefits for the person who receives feedback, but also has benefits for the person who gives the feedback. Because in thinking through what it is that this piece of work represents and what needs to happen to improve it, the students are forced to internalize the success criteria. And they're able to do it in the context of somebody else's work, which is less emotionally charged than your own. So what we see routinely now, we see it very, very commonly, is when students have given feedback to others about a piece of work, their own subsequent attempts at that same work are much improved because they are now much clearer about what good work in that task looks like. So that's been, and I think one of the real breakthroughs is just the real benefit of peer and self-assessment, both for the person who is doing the assessment, self-assessment, and the person who's giving feedback, the peer assessment. We see students being very, very effective commentators on each other's work and giving very, very sound advice, sometimes a lot harder than the teacher would give. One of the things that you see quite routinely in classrooms is children being much tougher on each other than the teacher would dare to be because of the emotional relationships and the power relationships there. But actually, it's generally pretty much spot on.
Experience delivering professional development, I guess, has told me that teachers really need concrete exemplars and practical strategies if you're going to make a change to classroom practice. Not dissimilar to what the students need in our classes. It's really assessment for learning for the staff as well. So we started by looking at an example of a Year 11 English class where they were doing orals that were being podcast. Classes, Class A and Class B, that in the first semester had very, very similar results. You can see from the graph that both classes had a similar number of A's, similar number of B's, etc. When we assign some numbers to those, you'll see that the average for Class A was 8.62 and the average for Class B 8.68, so they're almost identical. Both classes averaged between a C and a C+ for their first semester grades, with both classes students getting 2 A's. So what we had was classes of a similar standard. They were both similar size. They were both mixed ability classes. Both of the staff had similar experience and ability in teaching Year 11 English. The teachers had done some joint planning and come up with this unit of work together. They had set the same tasks and the same summative assessment task at the end, and they jointly marked it so that there was consistency in the marking in a moderation process. The actual task involved the students going to the central market where they would immerse themselves in the sights and sounds and smells of the central market. Then they had to reproduce that in an oral back at school where they fully described that situation so that someone who wasn't there could imagine being there. And in this case, they produced that into a podcast. With Class B, we decided to trial some of the assessment for learning strategies, whereas Class A continued teaching as they normally had done, where they were doing some formative assessment, but not explicitly as we did with Class B. So with Class A, we started by outlining the unit of work, explaining what the students had to do, went through the task criteria with them. We asked them to do a trial task first. This was the formative assessment part, where they would pick something that they were familiar with, for instance, their family pet, and they would write and describe that in full detail, using similes and metaphors, personification, etc., as they've been asked to do in the real task. They then handed that up to the teacher. Unfortunately, there wasn't time for the teacher to mark that and get it back to them prior to the excursion to the central market. So off we went to the central market. The students had a couple of hours walking around, making notes of the things that they saw. They then got back to school the next week, and that trial task had been marked and handed back to them. We then did some T&D on how to do a podcast. They then wrote their scripts, they recorded their podcast and submitted the assignments. And then there was the joint marking, as I said, that went on, and the moderation. Then with Class B, the one that was doing the assessment for learning focus, we outlined the unit of work just the same as with the first class. But rather than just explaining the task criteria, what they had to do, we also looked at the learning intentions, what they were actually going to learn during the time. And what was important here was that rather than just the teacher going through the learning intentions, we formed professional learning communities within the class. So the students were working in groups where they were discussing the learning, not just working in groups on the task together. So in groups of 3, the students picked one of the learning intentions each and then described that in their own words and talked to their learning partners about that, so they completely unpacked the learning intentions as a group. The next thing that we did was we gave them a detailed rubric which showed them the success criteria. And we based that on the new performance standards for Year 11 English. But rather than just giving them the rubric, we thought that it was important that they actually unpacked the rubric and used it. So we shared some examples with them. We gave them an A standard podcast and a C/D borderline standard podcast, where they then marked those using the rubric, discussed them in the learning teams, then we discussed them as a whole group. The students later described that as the second most important thing for them improving their mark. The fact that they really understood what they had to do and they had completely unpacked that as a group.
Hiya. Found something. Well, it was mainly sort of greenish. Think it was a tree. Or a bush or something, I don't know. Oh yeah. I was at the Biographical Gardens, that's it. Okay, back to my green thingy. Well, it was big. And did I say it was green already? We went to Adelaide in the bus. Spiky, that's it, spiky, as well as green. I think that's it. Thank you for listening. Steve Hicks, Mrs. Newland's class, English podcast on the Central Market. Still 4 stalls away, but I can smell them already. Anticipation, captivated by the smell, not concentrating, almost knocked over a short, balding Asian man. Unusually large glasses. Smell's getting stronger. 1 stall to go. I'm surrounded by cheese. Onwards. What's she doing there? A rather robust, middle-aged woman, standing right in the way. Internal chuckle. I can't help thinking someone her size doesn't need so many nuts. Impatient now. There they are, pressed up against the glass, beckoning. 315 grams of salted beer nuts, please. I don't need to see him to know what he's doing. The scraping of the metal scoop thrust into the bulk bin, the soft rattle as they fall into the scales. Not long now. Fingers wrapped around the bulging brown bag, still warm. I'm reminded of my father, bringing me here when I was young. We would fight over the nuts. Steam escaping as a small gap appears in the top of the bag. Smell intensifies. Salt on my tongue. Crunch. Licking the salt off my fingers. Thank you, Mr. Charlesworth. And I think I'll give my dad a call.
The trial task was the same as the first group, but this time rather than handing it up to the teacher for marking, they completed the task and then did what we called green is for growth and purple is perfect feedback. So it was peer feedback. So in their learning teams, the students read each other's scripts and underlined bits in green where they thought it could be improved. So green was for growth. And they underlined bits in purple where they thought it was really well done. And after they'd read through the scripts, they would then share that with the student who had written the script. They would have to explain to them why they thought something needed improving and how it could be improved, or why something was perfect. The second part of that, because this was an oral, the student who had written the script then read it to their 2 learning partners. And this time they circled with the green and the purple pens. So they were giving them feedback on how well the spoken word was coming out. Those 2 bits, the peer feedback, the students definitely described as being the most powerful part of the learning process. They got more out of that. And of course this was done before they'd gone to the Central Market. So they were going down there with all of this feedback on how they could have improved their performance. They went on the excursion the same time as the other group. They did the same T&D on how to do a podcast. They then wrote their scripts, but because they had come back with far more detailed notes on what they'd seen, heard, smelt, experienced at the Central Market, because of the feedback they had before going, they were far more directed. And so they got their scripts written in half the time that the other group took. That gave them the time then to do a draft recording of their podcast. They then did some self-assessment. They used the rubric and marked their own podcast against the rubric. They then used the purple and green pencils and went through it themselves, a few of them actually also asked their mates to come and listen to it as well. What we found by doing that was that only 3 out of the entire class chose not to re-record it. So most weren't happy with their performance the first time round and had time to re-record it. So they then submitted their re-recorded podcasts and the joint marking happened. If you have a look now at the comparison of the results, you can see that Class B in red, who did the formative assessment, the assessment for learning, had hugely improved their scores. In fact, if we look at the comparison scores there, you see the average has gone from 8.68 up to 11.69. So they'd improved from between a C and a C plus up to between a B and a B plus as an average. The number of A's had gone from 3 to 11. One of the things that we spoke about at length after we finished this exercise was that Class B had had a huge advantage and there were some equity issues for the 2 classes. So what we did was, with Class A who hadn't done the assessment for learning, we gave those students 3 options. Option 1 was to take the mark. Option B was the teacher worked out their assessment at the end of the semester with that grade included and not included, and they then gave them the higher of the 2. And the third option was that they could redo the assessment task with us doing the assessment for learning with those students. Interesting to note though, the fact that we're saying that Class B has had a huge advantage. Because if that's the case, we've done nothing immoral with that class, we've done nothing illegal, we've just done some really good teaching strategies. So my question is, if they've had such a big advantage, why aren't we doing that with every class in every task? And the answer is simple, and teachers will tell you, they just don't have the time. How can they possibly fit formative assessment into a program that's already bulging when they haven't got time to get through everything now? I'd like to challenge that though, on 2 fronts. Firstly, do you have time to do it in your class? Both classes started the task at the same time and finished at the same time. It was a 2-week task. What we found with Class B, who had done the assessment for learning, was that they were very clear on why they were doing it and how they were to do it. They weren't just focused on what they were doing. And so they achieved far more in the same amount of time. They were highly focused. In terms of the teacher, we found that it took no longer to create the rubric and the 2 podcast examples than it did for Teacher A to mark the trial test. So in fact, Teacher B took no longer than Teacher A. So I guess I'm challenging that I don't think it's a time factor and it's not a knowledge factor. Most of our staff already knew this. I think it's about changing habits, that we fall back into what we know and what we're used to doing rather than what we should be doing. So I guess in summary, what we found was that it was far more powerful if we activated learning teams rather than just having the children working in groups. They were discussing the learning rather than just working on a task together. The second one was around the learning intentions, not just sharing what they were learning, but having the students unpacking it and discussing it rather than just the teacher going through it. With the success criteria, rather than just giving them a rubric, we gave them exemplars to mark using the rubric so they could see what an A looked like, they could see what a CD looked like, and they could understand the difference between them. So they really knew what it meant to get an A and how to achieve it. The peer evaluation, it wasn't just them swapping papers to mark and marking each other's work, it was giving feedback on the learning. The other thing that we found that the learning teams really helped was it enabled the teacher to go around and spend quality time with each group. So the quality of the feedback to individuals and the micro-teaching to individuals that occurred was far more rich than it can in a normal classroom where you're just delivering to the whole class at once. The teachers had time to go and do that explicit teaching. One of the main things that came out of this for us was the sense of letting go control and the power that had in the level of student thinking that was required in them actually unpacking the learning intentions, and them assessing each other's work, they had to understand it to a much deeper level to be able to give that feedback. And that didn't happen straight away. I mean, that took 2 or 3 lessons for us to get to that point where they were confidently giving that feedback. And one of the most exciting things for us is the fact that the staff have embraced the fact that they've been given permission to do less marking and more authentic assessment of where the students are really at.